Chapter 15. Now, I'll give you a break in a few minutes, folks. Don't become alarmed. All right. Chapter 15. And the war began. Vignet is Stephen Douglas. Pardon me, I mixed up. Frederick Douglass, folks. Vignet is a black man who was a slave at one point. Frederick Douglass decided to devote his life to freeing other slaves. At times it seemed like his work was in vain. He worked for 20 years, but he realized the Republican Party was only there to prevent the spread of slavery, not to eradicate it. You know, to him, the Republican Party was not going far enough. But he realized sooner than others that the Civil War was about slavery. All right. You had 7 states to the left. All told, 11 states left the Union. Now, folk, I've only seen this one time. But when last time I went to Stone Mountain, several years ago, I haven't been in recent years, but they have a plaque there commemorating, of course, they have a statue on the wall of Stone Mountain of Lee and Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson. But right in facing that statue, a plaque where they say that the people of Georgia voted 52% to 48% to stay with the Union, but the state legislature overruled and took Georgia out of the Union anyway. I don't know how true that is, but that's what that plaque said. But Georgia, as I think all of you know, was one of the states that left the Union. Left in 1861. Of course, Georgia shares a long border with South Carolina. Other states left. In the final analysis, the only slave states that stayed in the Union were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. In Missouri, there were a bunch of Germans who had moved in, foreign farmers, and they persuaded the rest of the Missourians to stay with the Union. But a bunch of outlaw bands began roaming around Missouri, and one of them was led by an outlaw named Jesse James. He got his start during the Civil War, him and his brother as Confederate snipers, waylaying persons whom they knew were not. Jesse James was a Confederate, along with his brother Robert. Kentucky had the same problem, a bunch of snipers going around shooting people who disagreed with them. But Kentucky officially stayed with the Union. Now, interesting enough, there was one state, Virginia. The state of Virginia broke from the Union, but 13 counties in the western part of Virginia said, we're not breaking, we're going to stay. And they formed their own state, the state of West Virginia. In 1862, West Virginia came into the Union as a separate state. They have remained separate to this day. All right. Now, here was the issue. 26 federal forts were in Southern territory. Most of them were manned by Southerners, so immediately the Southern people took over the forts. They claimed that they were theirs, even though officially they were federal property. They took over, except 2 of them, one in Pensacola and one in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. Oddly enough, the fort at Fort Sumter was commanded by a Southerner. Nevertheless, he decided he would not join, so when the Southern people demanded, give us your fort, he refused. So he sat there, holed up there at Fort Sumter, refusing to surrender the fort. James Buchanan turned the issue over to Abraham Lincoln and said, you handle it, I don't know what to do. So Lincoln had to make a decision. He decided finally that he could not let his troops starve. Troops were loyal. I mean, no, folk, I can understand Lincoln's viewpoint. I mean, you know, so he sent a ship that contained only food and medical supplies, no armaments. And he made it clear to Mr. Jefferson Davis. Now, Jefferson Davis had been elected president of the Confederacy. And Jefferson Davis had started out with his capital at Montgomery, Alabama, because Davis was from Alabama. But then Davis moved the capital to Richmond so he could better conduct the war. Richmond was only 100 miles from Washington, D.C. So Jefferson Davis was operating from Richmond. Jefferson Davis said, if you do anything to help those men, I'll fire on them. The vice president, who was had been Georgia's governor, urged Mr. Davis, don't fire on Fort Sumter. You don't realize what kind of problems it might create. Nobody knows what happened. Jefferson Davis said, if he supplies them. So Abraham Lincoln sent a supply ship nothing but food and medicine, no combat materials, to aid the people. When he did, Jefferson Davis sent a telegram to his men at Fort Sumter, fire on Fort Sumter. By this time you had instant communications in the world. The telegraph had been invented. Fort Sumter was fired on throughout the night. In the morning, Major Anderson of Fort Sumter surrendered. Only a horse had been killed. No human lives had been lost. This was not a portent of what was to come. And it turned out to be the biggest mistake perhaps Mr. Davis ever made. All of the North rose to their feet as one man and said, "They fired the first shots at us. We cannot stand by and take that." So the Northern people rose up. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. That seems like such a small number. Men began choosing sides. Most of your Southern people chose the Confederacy. Your Northern people chose the Union, most part. There were several issues. There wasn't just the issue of, there was the issue of states' rights, but the real issue, folk, ultimately was slavery. I mean, there was the issue of the banks, there was the issue of tariffs, there was the issue of we feel like the other side has done us wrong, all that, but the number one issue was slavery. Now, Southern historians for many years they were ashamed of the fact that their ancestors had fought over slavery, so they tried to say, oh no, the real issue was states' rights. But then if you look at the journals of the soldiers actually fighting, whether they be privates or officers, the real issue for both sides was slavery. The number one issue. The war was to last 4 years, and unlike Fort Sumter, the war was to cost more men than all of our other wars combined. Yes, you heard me right. The Civil War cost approximately 600,000 battlefield casualties. World War I only cost us 50,000 or so, and World War II only 250,000. It again depends on which book you read. The figures change from time to time. The Civil War again cost more than all the wars, owing to the fact that these men were fighting with 1860 rifles, but fighting with 1760 manuals. In other words, standing up straight and tall and shooting at the enemy, and it was just devastating. Now, late in the war, they finally started fighting from trenches and from foxholes, but that was later in the war. But at first, they fought right in the open, and the result was heavy, super heavy casualties on both sides. First fight in the war, battle at Fort Sumter. Mr. Davis believed that he knew a whole lot more about war than Lincoln. Lincoln had only served for a while in the National Guard, and he'd fought against Indians once in the National Guard. Davis had been an Army officer, I forget what rank, but a fairly high rank, and he'd served in the Mexican War, something Lincoln had not done. Davis thought he knew more about fighting, but it turned out Davis meddled among his generals, much more so than Lincoln. Lincoln turned out to be a better leader than Davis. But the Confederacy had better generals and better fighting men. Now, I'll insert this and then move on. Texas governor was Sam Houston, you know, the man who had gotten Texas independence. Sam Houston was from Illinois. He was a Northerner. When Texas left the Union against Sam Houston's wishes, Sam Houston resigned as governor. He said, I can't be governor of a state that left the Union. So Sam Houston resigned, but he told the people of the South as he was leaving office, he said, I know you are better fighters than those Yankees. And you have better, you're more used to the outdoors and more used to fighting than those Yankees. But those Yankees have a sense of stubbornness about them, and they won't quit fighting, and ultimately they're going to win because they too greatly outnumber you, and you cannot stand up to their numbers. The reason I remember this quote is because it turned out to be so prophetically true. As for Sam Houston himself, he died in 1863. 2 years before the war ended, he died without seeing the North and South united again. All right, folk, be back in about 10 minutes.